The moment another father saw the scars on my son's face, the color drained from his own, and before he said a single word, I knew our lives were about to change forever. I had watched Ethan walk through those school doors hundreds of times, but that Monday morning felt different in a way I couldn't explain. Maybe it was the way he kept adjusting the sleeve of his sweatshirt even though the weather forecast called for nearly 70 degrees. Maybe it was the way he avoided looking at his reflection in the glass entrance. Or maybe it was because a father learns to recognize the quiet moments when his child is carrying a weight too heavy for 12 years old. Ethan had lived with those scars for almost a decade. They stretched from the left side of his neck across part of his jaw and disappeared beneath his shirt. Faint lines continued down one arm, pale reminders of a day neither of us could ever erase. To me, they had long since become invisible. They were simply part of my son, no different than his blue eyes or the stubborn cowlick that refused to stay down every morning. But the rest of the world always seemed to notice them first. Some people stared. Others looked away too quickly. Children usually asked honest questions. Teenagers, unfortunately, often chose something else. I was halfway back to my truck when I heard laughter echo across the front sidewalk. It wasn't loud, but every parent knows the difference between children having fun and laughter aimed at someone. I turned just enough to see a group of boys standing near the flagpole. Ethan stood alone, his backpack hanging from one shoulder. One of the boys pointed toward Ethan's neck, while another whispered something that made the others grin. Ethan lowered his head without saying a word. My first instinct was to step in, but he had asked me not to. Dad, he had told me a month earlier, if you fight every battle for me, they'll only think I'm weaker. Those words had stayed with me ever since. So I watched from a distance, hoping today would be different. It wasn't. A taller boy I later learned was Brandon Hayes stepped closer, folded his arms, and said something that made Ethan instinctively pull his collar higher. I couldn't hear the exact words, but I saw my son's shoulders tighten. Then something unexpected happened. A black SUV rolled slowly toward the curb. The driver's door opened, and a man in an expensive business suit stepped out, clearly in a hurry. Brandon, he called firmly. You're going to be late. Brandon rolled his eyes and started walking toward him, still smirking. As Ethan turned to leave, the morning sun caught the scars on the side of his face. The businessman glanced up for only a second. Then he stopped moving. His briefcase slipped from his hand onto the pavement. His eyes locked onto Ethan's face with a look I had never seen before. It wasn't disgust. It wasn't curiosity. It was recognition mixed with disbelief. His lips parted, but no words came out. Brandon frowned and looked back at him. Dad, he asked. The man didn't answer. He took one slow step forward, staring at my son as though he had seen a ghost from another lifetime. And in that frozen silence, before anyone understood why, I realized the story behind Ethan's scars wasn't over after all. Ethan climbed into my truck that afternoon with the same quiet expression he wore after every difficult day, but fathers learn to hear the words their children never say. He buckled his seat belt, rested his backpack on his lap, and stared through the windshield while students streamed across the parking lot. I started the engine, but did not pull away. We simply sat there as the air conditioner hummed softly between us. Finally, I asked, was today harder than yesterday? He gave a small shrug without looking at me. It is fine, Dad. I had heard those two words so many times that they no longer sounded comforting. They sounded like a wall built by a boy who had grown tired of explaining himself. As we drove home through the familiar streets of our small Ohio town, I noticed him tugging the sleeve of his sweatshirt lower over his wrist, even though the afternoon sun had warmed the temperature to nearly 75 degrees. He had done that ever since elementary school, trying to hide the pale marks that climbed along his arm. I remembered when those scars had first begun to fade, from bright pink into lighter shades. Doctors had called it healing. Ethan had called it something else. He once told me they felt like permanent introductions because strangers always noticed them before they noticed his smile. Our little house sat at the end of a quiet street lined with maple trees. It was never fancy, but after my wife passed away, I had poured every spare weekend into making it feel safe for Ethan. The porch swing still creaked the same way it always had, and the old wind chime beside the front door still played its gentle notes whenever the breeze rolled through. Ethan walked inside, dropped his backpack beside the stairs, and headed toward the kitchen. Instead of reaching for the cookies he usually grabbed after school, he filled a glass with water, and quietly disappeared upstairs. That worried me more than anything. Children who stop following their ordinary routines are often carrying something much heavier than a backpack. I stood alone in the kitchen and found myself thinking about the businessman from that morning. The look on his face refused to leave my mind. I had seen shock before. I had seen guilt before. What I had witnessed outside the school was something deeper. It was the expression of someone who had unexpectedly found a missing piece of his own past. He had not looked at Ethan the way people usually did. He had looked at him as though he already knew those scars, as though he had seen them before they had ever healed. My thoughts were interrupted by the ringing of my cell phone. The school office appeared on the screen. My stomach tightened immediately. The assistant principal spoke politely, explaining that there had been another incident involving several students during lunch, although no one had been injured and the situation had ended quickly. She assured me everything was under control, but then she added one sentence that echoed in my mind long after the call ended. One of the parents has requested a meeting tomorrow morning. I asked which parent. There was a brief pause before she answered. Mr. Michael Hayes. I thanked her and ended the call. Through the kitchen window, I watched the evening sunlight settle across our backyard while a dozen unanswered questions crowded my thoughts. Whatever had happened years ago had clearly not stayed buried, and for reasons I still could not understand, Michael Hayes believed my son held the answer. That night, neither Ethan nor I slept very well. I could hear him turning over in his room long after the lights had gone out, and I found myself standing at the kitchen window more than once, staring into the darkness without really seeing anything. The request for a meeting kept replaying in my mind. Parents usually asked for conferences because they wanted to defend their children or complain about school policies. Something told me this was different. Michael Hayes had looked at Ethan with recognition instead of anger, and that single moment refused to leave me alone. The next morning arrived with gray clouds hanging low over town. Ethan came downstairs dressed in another long-sleeved sweatshirt even though the weather report promised sunshine by noon. He poured cereal into a bowl, took only a few bites, and quietly rinsed the dish in the sink. I noticed he avoided looking toward the hallway mirror before grabbing his backpack. That simple habit broke my heart, because I remembered when he used to smile at every reflection, completely unaware that he looked any different from anyone else. Childhood innocence disappears slowly until one day you realize it is gone. During the drive to school, neither of us said much. The silence was comfortable, the kind shared between people who loved each other enough to understand that words were not always necessary. Before he climbed out of the truck, I rested my hand on his shoulder. "Whatever happens today," I said softly, "remember that nothing about your face changes who you are." He offered a small smile that never quite reached his eyes. "I know, Dad. I am trying." Those 3 words stayed with me as I walked toward the administration building for the scheduled meeting. The assistant principal greeted me politely and led me into a small conference room overlooking the football field. A pot of coffee sat untouched in the corner beside a stack of paper cups. The room felt strangely quiet. Only one other person was already waiting inside. Michael Hayes stood near the window with both hands resting on the back of a chair. He looked completely different from the confident businessman I had seen the day before. His expensive suit was perfectly pressed, yet his expression suggested he had not rested all night. Dark circles framed his eyes, and he seemed older than I remembered. As I entered, he turned toward me but did not offer his hand immediately. Instead, his gaze searched my face with careful uncertainty before settling into something that looked almost apologetic. The assistant principal excused herself, explaining she would return in a few minutes after checking whether another staff member was available. The door closed, leaving the 2 of us alone. Michael finally spoke, his voice quieter than I expected. "Mr. Carter, I owe you an apology for yesterday." I nodded politely but waited. He looked down for a moment before continuing. "I was not expecting to see your son. When I noticed his scars, I lost my composure." He stopped speaking and drew a slow breath as though choosing every word carefully. "Those scars reminded me of something that happened many years ago, something I have never been able to forget." My heartbeat slowed instead of quickening. Somehow I already knew this conversation was reaching toward a past that neither of us had planned to revisit. Before I could ask another question, Michael reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and carefully removed a worn newspaper clipping that had clearly been folded and unfolded countless times over the years. He placed it gently on the conference table without saying another word. Then he looked directly into my eyes and whispered, "Please tell me, was your family living on Willow Creek Road 12 years ago?" For several seconds I could not answer him. My eyes drifted from Michael to the yellowed newspaper clipping lying between us. The paper had faded with time, but I immediately recognized the photograph printed near the bottom of the page. It showed the front of the old house on Willow Creek Road where my wife, my little boy, and I had once believed we would grow old together. Seeing that picture again felt like opening a door I had spent 12 years trying to keep closed. I slowly lowered myself into the chair across from him and nodded once. "Yes," I said quietly. "That was our home." Michael closed his eyes for a brief moment, as though my answer had confirmed a fear he had carried for years. When he looked back at me, there was no trace of the confident executive I had first imagined him to be. Instead, I saw a man weighed down by memories that had never stopped following him. He slid the newspaper closer to me. A headline across the top spoke about the neighborhood emergency that had taken place all those years ago. I remembered every phone call, every visitor, every letter of sympathy that arrived afterward. I had packed them all away because I believed looking backward would only keep Ethan and me from moving forward. "I kept this article," Michael said softly, "because I never forgave myself for what happened that day." My heartbeat slowed as I searched his face for answers. He continued before I could ask another question. "I was managing a construction project on the property next door. There was a temporary generator being used while crews finished repairs after a storm. I signed off on everything before leaving for a business trip. 2 days later, I received a call telling me there had been an accident involving the equipment." He swallowed hard and looked down at his hands. "The investigation eventually concluded that several unexpected mechanical failures had occurred. I was never charged with anything because no one believed I had intentionally done anything wrong. But legal reports never changed what I felt inside. I remained silent. I remembered the official explanations from years ago, but at the time I had been focused only on keeping my family together. Finding someone to blame had never brought me comfort." Michael continued speaking in the same careful voice. "I asked about your family for months afterward. I was told that your wife had passed away and that your son survived with permanent scars. Then your names disappeared from every report. I hired private investigators twice over the years, but they could not locate you after you moved away." My hands tightened around the edges of the newspaper. I had changed towns, changed jobs, and quietly built a new life because Ethan deserved the chance to grow up without strangers remembering the worst day of his childhood. Apparently, someone else had been searching for that same past all along. Michael looked toward the conference room door before returning his attention to me. "Yesterday morning, I was only coming to school because Brandon had forgotten his science project at home. I was thinking about meetings and deadlines. Then I looked up and saw Ethan. The scars, they matched the description that has lived in my memory for 12 years. His voice nearly disappeared. I recognized him before I even understood why. A heavy silence settled over the room. Neither of us spoke for several moments. Outside the window, I could see students crossing the football field toward the gymnasium, laughing with friends, completely unaware that two fathers inside a small conference room were watching the past quietly return. Then Michael leaned forward and asked the one question I never imagined I would hear. "David, after everything my mistake cost your family, is there any chance you will allow me to make even a small part of it right?" I looked at Michael for a long time before answering because the question he had asked was much heavier than it sounded. People often believe forgiveness arrives in one dramatic moment, but that has never been my experience. Real forgiveness grows slowly, one choice at a time, and sometimes it begins with nothing more than the willingness to listen. "I do not know if anything can make the past right," I finally said, "but I am willing to hear whatever you came here to tell me." Michael nodded with visible relief, although the sadness in his eyes never disappeared. "That is more kindness than I deserve," he replied quietly. Before either of us could continue, the assistant principal returned to the conference room. She smiled politely, unaware of the conversation she had interrupted, and explained that Brandon had also been called in so everyone could discuss the incident from the previous day. A few moments later, the door opened again. Brandon stepped inside with his hands in his pockets, looking confused more than anything else. His confident attitude from the school entrance was gone. He glanced at his father, then at me, and finally toward the empty chair beside the table. Ethan entered behind him with a guidance counselor. My son immediately noticed me and offered a cautious smile before sitting across from Brandon. Neither boy spoke. The room felt unusually still. The assistant principal asked Brandon to explain what had happened outside before classes began. Brandon shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "We were joking," he muttered. "I did not think it was a big deal." Ethan remained silent, staring at the tabletop. The counselor gently asked him how those comments had made him feel. My son hesitated before answering in the calm voice I had heard so many times at home. "It is not really about one day," he said. "People ask questions or make comments almost every week. After a while you stop trying to explain." Hearing those words spoken aloud seemed to affect Michael more than anyone else in the room. He slowly turned toward his son. "Brandon," he said softly, "did you know how Ethan got those scars?" Brandon shook his head. "No, Dad." "Did you ever ask him?" "No." Michael lowered his eyes for a moment before looking back at his son. "Then you judged someone without knowing anything about his story." His voice never became angry, yet every word carried quiet disappointment. Brandon's shoulders slowly sank. For the first time, he looked directly at Ethan instead of at the scars. "I guess I never thought about it," he admitted. Ethan gave a small nod. "Most people do not." The assistant principal thanked both boys for being honest and began discussing ways the school could prevent similar situations. I listened, but my attention kept drifting toward Michael. He looked as though he wanted to say much more, yet he carefully held back. Finally, after the meeting officially ended and everyone stood to leave, Michael asked if he could speak with Ethan for just a minute. I instinctively looked at my son. This was not my decision to make. Ethan studied Michael's face for several quiet seconds before giving a small nod. Michael knelt so that he was no longer towering over a 12-year-old boy. His voice was barely above a whisper when he spoke. "Ethan, there is something about your scars that you deserve to know. And before I tell you, I need to tell you how deeply sorry I am that my own son ever made you feel ashamed of them." Ethan looked at him with quiet curiosity, unaware that the next few minutes would reveal a truth neither of us had expected to hear. Ethan looked at Michael with the cautious curiosity that only a child can have when he senses adults are carrying a secret much larger than he understands. Michael remained kneeling for another moment before slowly standing again, almost as though he wanted to make certain every word he spoke would be honest and measured. "Your father has spent years protecting you," he said gently. "Today I want to honor that by telling you the truth without taking away anything he has already given you." Ethan glanced toward me. I nodded because I knew the time for hiding the past had finally ended. Michael folded his hands together and took a slow breath. "Many years ago, before I ever knew your family, I was responsible for overseeing a construction project near your neighborhood. Some equipment that should have been removed remained on the property because of mistakes made during the final inspection. I signed the paperwork believing everything had been handled correctly. I was wrong." His voice never shook, but I could hear the weight behind every sentence. The official investigation later determined that several unexpected mechanical problems happened after I left. No one believed I had intended for anyone to be harmed, but I have carried the responsibility ever since because I was the person in charge. Leadership means accepting the consequences even when the outcome was never your intention. Ethan listened without interrupting. His fingers rested quietly on the straps of his backpack while he absorbed each sentence. Michael continued. "Afterward, I tried to find your family. I wanted to apologize. I wanted to help in any way I could. But your father had moved away to give you a fresh start, and I could never locate either of you. Every year, I wondered how you were doing. Every year, I hoped life had become kinder to you than it had been during those difficult months." Ethan looked down at the faint lines across his arm before asking the question that had clearly been sitting in his mind. "So, every time I looked at these scars, you were remembering me too?" Michael's eyes filled with emotion, and he nodded slowly. "Yes, not because I saw scars. Because I remembered a little boy whose future I prayed would still be bright." The room became quiet again. I realized then that Ethan was no longer looking at Michael with suspicion. He was trying to understand the difference between someone who made a terrible mistake and someone who refused to take responsibility for it. That distinction mattered. I had spent years teaching him that life was rarely divided into simple categories of heroes and villains. Good people sometimes carried enormous regret. Good people also chose whether to hide from it or face it. Michael reached into his briefcase and carefully placed a thin folder on the table. Inside are copies of every scholarship fund, children's recovery program, and community project I have supported over the past 12 years. None of it erased what happened. None of it was meant to buy forgiveness. I simply promised myself that if I could not change the past, I would spend the rest of my life creating something better for other families. Ethan did not open the folder. Instead, he looked at me once more. "Dad?" he asked quietly. "Did you know any of this before today?" I slowly shook my head. "No, son. I believed the past was finished. I never imagined it had been following someone else all these years." Ethan drew a slow breath and turned back toward Michael. "Then maybe today is not only about finding the past," he said softly. "Maybe it is about deciding what happens after it." Michael lowered his head, and for the first time since we met, I saw a small measure of hope replace the guilt that had lived in his eyes for more than a decade. Ethan's words stayed with all of us long after the meeting officially ended. Nobody rushed toward the door. Nobody seemed eager to return to ordinary life because nothing about that morning felt ordinary anymore. Brandon remained unusually quiet, standing a few feet away with his backpack hanging loosely from one shoulder. He kept glancing at Ethan before quickly looking down again, as though he finally understood that every joke he had made had landed on a story he had never bothered to learn. Michael walked over to his son and rested a gentle hand on his shoulder. "There is something I should have taught you much sooner," he said. "Every person you meet is carrying a history you cannot see. Kindness is not something people earn after explaining themselves. It is where we should begin." Brandon swallowed hard before turning toward Ethan. "I am sorry," he said quietly. "I know those words cannot erase everything I said. I just wish I had asked instead of assuming." Ethan studied him for several seconds. My son had inherited his mother's thoughtful nature. He never answered difficult questions too quickly. Finally he spoke. "I cannot pretend it did not hurt, but I think asking questions would have been better than making jokes." Brandon nodded immediately. "You are right. It was a simple exchange, yet it carried more honesty than many conversations I had witnessed between adults over the years." The assistant principal suggested that both boys participate in a student leadership program focused on building a more welcoming school community. I expected Ethan to hesitate, but instead he surprised me. "If it helps someone else feel less alone, I would like to do it," he answered. Brandon looked equally surprised before quietly adding, "I want to help too." As we walked out of the administration building, Michael asked whether he could buy Ethan and me lunch sometime during the following week. "Not because I believe a meal fixes anything," he explained. "I only hope we can continue talking when there is not a conference table between us." I looked at Ethan rather than answering myself. He thought for a moment before giving a small nod. "I think that would be okay." Michael smiled for what seemed like the first genuine time since we had met. Outside, the afternoon sun had finally broken through the clouds. Students crossed the campus laughing, carrying sports equipment and musical instruments, completely unaware that two families had just changed the direction of each other's lives inside a small office. As Ethan and I walked toward my truck, he reached up and adjusted the collar of his sweatshirt out of habit. Then he paused. Without saying a word, he lowered it again. The faint lines on his neck remained visible in the sunlight, and for the first time in a very long while, he did not seem interested in hiding them. I noticed the change immediately, but chose not to mention it. Some victories are too personal to interrupt with words. During the drive home, Ethan stared out the passenger window for several miles before quietly asking, "Dad, do you think people can really change?" I smiled gently without taking my eyes off the road. "I think people change the moment they decide that the truth matters more than their pride." Ethan considered that answer for a while before nodding to himself. "Then maybe today was not the end of something," he said. "Maybe it was the beginning." I glanced at him and realized I had not seen that peaceful expression on his face in years. Yet even as hope slowly returned to our lives, I could not ignore one lingering thought. Michael had spent 12 years trying to find us, but he had never explained what had finally led him to search our names again just weeks before that morning. And something told me that answer would reveal another piece of the story neither Ethan nor I had seen coming. 3 days later, Ethan and I met Michael and Brandon at a small family restaurant just outside town. It was the kind of place where the waitress remembered regular customers by name and fresh pies cooled behind the front counter. Michael had chosen it because, as he quietly admitted, it reminded him that important conversations did not belong in expensive offices. They belonged wherever people felt comfortable enough to tell the truth. Ethan seemed more relaxed than I had expected. Brandon greeted him with an awkward smile that slowly became genuine when Ethan smiled back. Watching two 12-year-old boys discover that honesty was easier than pretending to be enemies gave me hope that adults often underestimate children. We ordered lunch, and for a while the conversation stayed simple. They talked about baseball, science class, and a new video game that everyone at school seemed to be discussing. The tension that had filled the conference room only days earlier slowly disappeared. After the meals arrived, Michael reached into a leather folder and placed a single envelope on the table. He slid it toward me, but made no effort to push it into my hands. "Before you worry," he said, "this is not money, and it is not an attempt to erase the past. I know that cannot be done." Curious, I opened the envelope. Inside was a copy of the application for a foundation that Michael had quietly established several years earlier. It provided scholarships for children who had experienced life-changing medical challenges and funded confidence-building camps where young people could meet others who understood what it felt like to look different. I looked up in surprise. Michael smiled faintly. "I never spoke publicly about why I started it. I thought keeping the focus on the children mattered more than telling my own story." He paused before continuing. "Last month, one of the volunteers showed me a photograph from a local school newsletter. Ethan was standing in the background receiving an academic award. I recognized the scars immediately. That photograph is what finally brought me here." Suddenly, everything made sense. He had not found us by accident. Hope, persistence, and one ordinary photograph had connected two families after 12 long years. Ethan quietly studied the brochure before asking, "How many kids have been helped?" Michael answered without hesitation, "More than 400 families across the state." Ethan looked genuinely impressed. "That is a lot of people." Michael nodded. Every time another child smiled because someone believed in them, I reminded myself that responsibility does not end when a news story disappears. It becomes part of the person you choose to be. Brandon looked at his father with an expression I had not seen before. It was not simply admiration. It was understanding. "You never told me any of this," he admitted. Michael smiled sadly. "I wanted you to learn kindness because it was the right thing to do, not because of my mistakes. Looking back, maybe I should have trusted you with the truth much sooner." Brandon lowered his head. "I think I would have made different choices if I had known." Ethan reached across the table and gently tapped Brandon's sleeve. "You can still make different choices," he said. "We both can." I watched the two boys exchange a quiet smile, and in that moment I realized they were no longer defined by what had happened outside the school entrance. They were beginning to define themselves by what they chose to do next. As we stood to leave, Michael asked whether Ethan would consider speaking at the Foundation's annual family gathering later that year. Ethan looked at me for guidance, but before I could answer, he surprised us all. "I will," he said. "If my story helps one kid stop hiding, then maybe these scars have been telling the wrong story for long enough." 6 months later, I stood near the back of a community auditorium watching Ethan adjust the microphone with steady hands. The annual gathering organized by Michael's foundation had grown larger than anyone expected, filling the room with families from across the state. Some children had visible scars. Others carried challenges that could not be seen at all. Yet every face in that audience reflected the same quiet hope that comes from realizing they were not alone. Ethan no longer wore long sleeves to hide his arm, even though autumn had arrived and the air carried a familiar chill. He had chosen a simple blue shirt, and the faint lines on his neck remained visible beneath the stage lights. For the first time since he was a little boy, he was not trying to disappear. He smiled at the audience before speaking in the calm, thoughtful voice that had always reminded me so much of his mother. "When I was younger," he began, "I believed people noticed my scars before they noticed me. I spent years wishing I looked different. Then I realized something important. Every person has marks left by life. Some are visible, and some are hidden. What matters is not whether we have scars. What matters is what we choose to become because of them." The room remained completely silent as children and parents listened with tears in their eyes. Michael stood beside me near the back wall. Neither of us spoke until Ethan finished and the audience rose in a long standing ovation. Michael quietly wiped away a tear before whispering, "I spent 12 years believing I had nothing left to give that family except an apology. I never imagined they would give something back to me instead. I understood exactly what he meant. Healing had not arrived because someone forgot the past. Healing had arrived because everyone involved finally chose honesty over silence and compassion over pride. Brandon walked onto the stage after the applause faded and handed Ethan a small wooden plaque made by students in the school's woodworking club. Across the front, someone had carved a simple sentence. "Every scar has a story." Ethan smiled as he traced the letters with his fingertips. "I think we should hang this in the school library," Brandon said. "Maybe it will remind people to ask questions before making judgments." Ethan nodded immediately. "I think that is the perfect place for it." Driving home that evening, I realized our little house felt different than it had only a few months earlier. The porch swing still creaked. The wind chimes still sang whenever the breeze passed through. Yet the silence that once filled those rooms had been replaced by something much gentler. Ethan talked about baseball tryouts, upcoming science projects, and ideas for volunteering with the foundation during summer break. He sounded like a boy who had finally stopped carrying the entire weight of his past by himself. Before going inside, he paused on the front porch and looked toward the sunset spreading across the Ohio sky. "Dad," he said with a quiet smile, "I used to think these scars were the worst thing that ever happened to me." He rested his hand lightly against his neck before continuing. "Now I think they helped me meet the people I was supposed to become." I looked at my son and realized that the marks on his skin had never been symbols of weakness. They were reminders of resilience, kindness, and second chances. They had brought one family face to face with responsibility, another family toward healing, and two young boys toward friendship. That day I finally understood something I wish every parent and every child could know. The world will always notice what is visible first, but character is what people remember longest. And sometimes the very thing we spend years trying to hide becomes the light that helps someone else find their way home.